Hello and welcome to Ukraine Today. I'm Volodymyr Sulhub, and right now I'm joined by the Ambassador of Sweden to Ukraine, Mr. Andreas von Baccarat. Mr. von Baccarat, welcome to Ukraine Today.
Thank you for having me.
Mr. von Baccarat, starting with illegal annexation of Crimea last year and continuing with fueling the war in eastern Ukraine, Russia has been violating international law on each and every step and seems to be getting away with it. Do you think that Russia has become a real threat to peace and security on the European continent right now?
Well, you're absolutely right. What we've seen in the last 1.5 years is that Russia has illegally annexed Crimea. It has tried militarily to destabilize eastern Ukraine. And this, of course, has had severe and tragic consequences for Ukraine. Almost 7,000 people dead, 1.5 million internally displaced people. But it has also had consequences for Europe's security, including for the Nordic Baltic states and for Sweden. The Russian aggressions and the more aggressive Russian behavior, as you pointed out, has not only been, I would say, a serious and flagrant breach against international law and against Russia's international commitments, but it has also been a very serious violation of the European security order. I would go as far as to say that the Russian behavior, the Russian aggressions we've seen throughout the last 1.5 years is probably the most serious threat to peace in Europe that we've seen since the end of the Cold War. Now, how does Sweden intend to face these challenges? Well, to put it short, we intend to strengthen our cooperation with all our partners, including the Nordic and Baltic states, including within the EU and including with the NATO countries.
Well, now that you mentioned Sweden's reaction to the increased threats of Russia's activity on the European continent, just in July, 2 months ago, there was quite a diplomatic standoff between Sweden and Russia when the first reports came out that Sweden is considering joining NATO. And it went up all the way to Russian ambassador saying that there'll be military consequences if this happens. So, Mr. Ambassador, is this really happening? Is Sweden really considering joining NATO?
Well, a few things. First and foremost, Sweden's security policy and foreign policy is only decided by Sweden and by no one else. And indirect threats that have been posed by Russia are, of course, completely unacceptable. We have been a very staunch supporter of Ukraine's right to choose its own future, and the same goes, of course, for Sweden. When it comes to NATO membership, there are different views among the political parties in Sweden. The Swedish government believes that a NATO membership would not strengthen Sweden's security. And let me explain a few important things to understand the Swedish government's position on this. The Swedish government believes that the best way we can strengthen our security is through cooperation with other partners and other countries. In 2009, the Swedish Parliament adopted a solidarity declaration, which means that Sweden will not remain passive in the event of a military assault or a catastrophe in any of the EU countries or in any of the Nordic countries. And we expect the EU countries and the Nordic countries to behave in the same way if Sweden would be a victim of a military attack or a catastrophe. And this declaration also says that Sweden shall be ready both to provide military and civilian assistance and to receive military and civilian assistance. Secondly, the government has, together with a broad coalition of the opposition parties, decided to increase defense spending. Thirdly, we're working very hard to see how we can further strengthen the defense cooperation we already have with the other Nordic Baltic countries, not least with Finland. And also to strengthen our cooperation with the NATO countries. We have already worked with NATO since 1994, and we will continue to strengthen this cooperation.
Well, Mr. Ambassador, here you have touched on a very interesting subject. You say that you expect, in case of any external aggression, for the European countries, for the Nordic countries, to step up and help Sweden defend its borders. This is exactly the same which Ukraine was hoping back in 1994 when it signed the Budapest Memorandum, when the Permanent Security Council members guaranteed its sovereignty and territorial integrity. This is the same which Ukraine hoped when Ukraine was cooperating with NATO countries since end of 90s. But at the same time, apart from diplomatic efforts, Ukraine isn't seeing that. Do you think that Sweden might find itself in a similar situation unless you join NATO?
Well, first of all, I would argue that we have been working very hard to support Ukraine in almost every possible way, not least when it comes to our political support. Sweden has been crystal clear from the very start of this, what I don't like to call the Ukraine crisis. I rather call it the Russia crisis. Starting 1.5 years ago with the illegal annexation of Crimea.
Yeah, it wasn't meant to criticize.
No. But I just want to be very clear that Sweden has been very clear and very much arguing that the EU needs to show a very tough response to these Russian aggressions, including through increased sanctions. I mean, when it comes to Sweden's relationship with other European countries and with the Nordic Baltic countries, we have made this declaration that we intend not to remain passive if there is a military assault or catastrophe in any of their countries, and we expect the same treatment back. It's not defined exactly in which way this help will be given or received, but it's a very important political message to our partners.
Well, let's hope it doesn't come to that, obviously, Mr. Ambassador. Mr. Ambassador, Sweden and Russia historically have had very difficult relations. And with Ukraine being often the playground for tensions between your country and Russia, and we're talking about centuries of history here. In your opinion, where do the relations between Sweden and Russia stand right now?
Well, basically, we have been very, very clear that the Russian aggression against Ukraine is completely unacceptable, and we have been very actively advocating for a strong EU response against this aggression, including through sanctions. But on sanctions, let me be very clear that sanctions is not an end in itself. It's not a way to punish Russia. It's a way to make sure that Russia changes its behavior vis-à-vis Ukraine, that it stops its military aggression against Ukraine, and that it stops its annexation of Crimea.
So what is the way to punish Russia?
Nobody would be happier than Swedish business and Swedes if we can restore the relations with Russia. When you said that we have had a difficult relation with Russia for a long time, I don't really agree. I mean, it deteriorated severely after the Russian aggression against Ukraine. But we've had, for a long time, we have had a very flourishing trade between our countries. There's a lot of people-to-people contacts between Sweden and Russia. The reason why I learned Russian some 15, 20 years ago is because I admire the Russian culture, and I really have a big interest into Russia. And this admiration and this interest is shared by many Swedes. So we really hope that Russia will change its policy vis-à-vis Ukraine in order for us to restore our bilateral relations. But until that happens, until the annexation of Crimea is lifted, we cannot have business as usual with Russia.
Understood. Well, there are hopes with many Ukrainians similar as well. Mr. Ambassador, unfortunately, we're running out of time, and I thank you very much for finding the opportunity to come and talk to us. This was Volodymyr Sulhub for Ukraine Today, together with the Ambassador of Sweden to Ukraine, Mr. Andreas von Beckerath. Thank you for watching us.